We're at Stanford, which really is a university that shaped both the trajectory of artificial intelligence, but also debates over its ethical use. And today's panel explores one of the most consequential intersections of our time, which is AI and the military. So I'm a strong believer that for any trend, there's a sector you can look at to understand where it's going and see early warning signals. And for me, this is the military. And it's really a credit to John that he's willing to take on this topic. It's not everywhere on the AI agenda, but the stakes could not be higher consequence, right? If you have drones, which are predominantly the means of warfare in Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, and they have the ability to make lethal strikes with or without human approval, and eventually we may move to a war that's totally fought through AI. These are really important questions for our day, and we have 5 amazing experts. So let me tell you about them, then we'll give each of them a question, and then Davey will take questions from the audience at the end if there's time. So first of all, Jason Hansberger is a colonel in the US Air Force and is founding director of the Air Force Stanford AI and Autonomy Research Center. Jason is at the forefront of thinking about how autonomous systems will reshape the future of air power. And in his most recent flying assignment, he was a squadron commander of the unit that flies the vice president and other dignitaries in Air Force Two. So you're very safe in Jason's hands, at least on the plane. Vik Pattabi is head of mission software at Anduril Industries, a top US military contractor, but also a disruptor. Founded by Palmer Luckey, and focused on AI-powered autonomous military systems. Vik currently serves as general manager of Anduril's mission autonomy business line. And on a personal note, Vik just got married last week and has an identical twin brother who also went to Stanford and who is working at a former Palantir security-oriented startup. So we love people that come right off their honeymoons onto John's events. So thank you, Vik. And on my left, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Chapa is Director of Innovation at the Strategic Studies Group of the US Air Force and previously served as the first Chief Responsible AI Ethics Officer for the Air Force. Not all of us knew there was someone like that. Focused on the ethical implications of autonomous systems and AI in military operations. To Joe's left, we're very lucky to have Scott Hellman, who spent 17 years with the FBI and is the Assistant Special Agent in charge of cyber operations with the FBI's San Francisco division. Scott's been on the front lines of cybercrime investigations and nation-state cyber threats to the homeland and offers critical insights into how AI intersects with national security challenges here at home. And I will add on a personal note, we both have experience being hacked at some point or other, so FBI doesn't make you completely safe from this. And to the left, we have Marco Pavone, who is an associate professor of aeronautics and astronautics at Stanford and leads autonomous systems research at NVIDIA, focusing on robotics and autonomy. So as you can tell, we could be here all afternoon, but we promise to be off the stage in about 20 minutes. Jason, let me start with you. How are autonomous systems reshaping the future of air power, and what has most surprised you in the pace you are seeing in the military planning and live conflict? So, for example, 2025, a study found that tactical drones accounted for 2/3 of Russia's equipment losses in Ukraine. Does that surprise you? Were you expecting that? What do you think?
Yeah, no, that totally shocked me. 4 years ago, I would never have guessed that drones would play the role that they do in the Russia-Ukraine battle. But before I go any further, I do make one disclaimer. Any opinions that I give today, and I will say it for Joe too, so he doesn't have to say it twice, is those are our opinions, not necessarily reflective that of the government or the Air Force.
You can add Scott in.
I second that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think what's most shocking to me is when we think about drones, that's a tool that we're beginning to see the embodiment of AI and autonomy within. But so if we just, the tool of a drone is surprising to me that it became that dominant within the battle space. That's in and of itself like a really surprise kind of advance of a technology, but even apart from AI and autonomy. What we're seeing now is the embodiment of AI and autonomy in these drones, which is the latest, I think, public newspaper article about Ukraine is now launching drones from the start of the mission to the end of the to the end of the mission, and like giving them autonomy, and even like putting small swarms together on autonomous missions with that have the ability to end in a lethal effect. That's new. That's interesting. That's very novel, and we haven't seen that before. This year, and so what I think, I can't tell you what the next embodiment of AI and autonomy will be. It's not going to. I don't think it'll stop at drones. Maybe it's the next war. It's submarines, or it's airplanes, or it's dogs. We don't know. But I'm very, very confident that AI tools will continue to be developed, and autonomous tools will continue to be developed in order to control these autonomous beings. And there'll be a lot of work in building the ability to orchestrate across heterogeneous types of embodiments on all sorts of different platforms. And so I think as we look forward, like, what are we going to see? We're going to see more AI tooling used to control and orchestrate, but also autonomous tool. If we build this complexity and this level of mass, then we're going to need a lot of AI tools and help in decision making, and continuing an awareness of what, if we blue and red, like good guys, bad guys, what the state of all those things are. Well, this is highly complex and will require additional AI tools.
Fantastic. That is so great. And what a great turnover to Vik, who we are going to ask to predict a little bit about the future here. So Vik, you oversee AI systems that integrate sensors, drones, and defense platforms, so everything Jason was talking about. From that vantage point, paint us a picture of what you think military conflict in the battlefield could look like in 2040. So specifically, will we still have human soldiers? Where will final military decisions be made? And will humans still be in the loop?
Well, first off, let me just say thank you for having me, and I'm really honored to be amongst these esteemed panelists. And that was a great disclaimer. I'm just going to echo that disclaimer. I'm a little bit of two minds. I personally tend to be very much so an AI optimist. My wife works at a frontier AI lab, so I have to be an AI optimist. On the other hand, just looking at actually historical trends of how these technologies are used and deployed and get into the field. YOLO came out as a computer vision model in 2015, 2016. It's really, the DoD or DOW now is not, I think, really strong adopter of, computer vision sort of for fully autonomous mission execution right now. We're still in a very early stage of regulation and sort of assessment of these technologies. And it, practically just takes a lot of work to take something conceptual from a lab to something that is fielded in large scales. That being said, 2040 is a long time away, and I have a hard time believing that we're not going to make a ton of progress between now and then. So I'll maybe break my answer up into two parts. I think there's one function of the military, which is the sort of sense and effect, deliver effects based on our target policies. And what I probably would expect to have happen there is the sensors and effectors will be far more capable. And as a result, you'll see sort of a compression of the decision cycle and the decision chain. So, policymakers, I think, will never directly launch drones, but, you might see fewer steps in the chain of command from a policy or sort of a command strategy or something like that to then, where systems are being affected. I think the more interesting part is actually on the non-sense and effect side of the military. In my mind, it's how we build the machine that builds the machine, if that makes sense. So, a large part of our defense spending and investment, and many service members are actually spending their time on not Frontlines work, but acquisition, sustainment, training, the man, train, and equip functions, and those look far more like traditional enterprises, traditional businesses, and there's a lot of work there to exploit the value of AI, right? We can have the most intelligent AIs, but if we don't have the physical matter, the robots, the sensors, the electronic systems to sort of house those AIs and go about and sort of do things in the world, we're not actually going to be using that intelligence to its maximal capability. And so I would expect actually that enterprise in the DoD or the DOW of building and fielding these systems and sustaining them and pushing them out in ways that they can be used, that will be substantially accelerated. So we'll see maybe new types of roles. Military leaders will actually become, almost like industrial policy leaders, like leveraging AI tools to figure out where and how and what to build and how to place it to then execute the types of strategies that we care about.
Great. Wow. We'll go to Marco with the question of whether there'll be human or robot soldiers in a moment. But let me go to Joe next. So you've been directly involved in how emerging technologies, including AI, are being integrated into U.S. defense planning. So how do you think AI and autonomy, the autonomy it enables, will reshape military ethics, especially as human decision makers move further and further back in the causal chain? And as Vik just told us, that decision making is going from hours to minutes. How is that going to influence where lethal effects come from?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know, but I want to try to constrain that answer a little bit. Has anyone ever heard of Karl von Clausewitz? Awesome. A couple of people have heard of Karl von Clausewitz, late 18th century, 19th century war theorist. If you've ever heard the aphorism that war is policy by other means, that's Clausewitz. He said two other things that I think are important. He said that war is a human endeavor, and he said that the nature of war is immutable, but the character of war can change with, among other things, changes in technology. And I think he's right on all three counts. So the nature of war as a human endeavor, I think, is going to continue no matter how good the AI gets. And that's just because what war is a violent clash over governance. And those are issues that humans care about. So no matter how good the technology gets, I think that war is going to remain a human endeavor. But how we understand the relationships between the humans and the machines, that is going to change. And I think it's going to change pretty dramatically. And the reason I tell you I don't know what that relationship looks like is because we've seen this before in our lifetimes, in my lifetime at least, with the advent of the Air Force's Predator and Reaper community, of which I was a part. And back then, in the early days of Predator and Reaper, say 2008 to 2010, there was a whole lot of academic discussion around how moving these pilots and crews physically from their weapons effects was going to cause them to care less about the violence that they were inflicting on the adversary. The Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Killings at the UN called this a PlayStation mentality. These crews are going to be, it's going to be like they're playing PlayStation, and they're going to become emotionally disconnected from their work. It turns out that was completely wrong, and we now have lots of empirical psychological evidence to show that those crews are actually deeply invested in the work that they're doing, right? Well, now, as you say, we're talking about taking those crews and putting them not further back physically, but further back in the causal chain. Then what will their emotional relationship be to the violence that they cause? I don't know yet, and I don't think you do either. And so one of the things I think it's incumbent upon us to watch is what metrics do we adopt to measure what the human's involvement is emotionally in the violence that they're using these tools to carry out. Okay, that's frame number one. We don't know yet. We got to wait, but let's keep one eye on that emotional relationship. The other frame that I'll offer you is that, as you've probably heard throughout panels yesterday and today, AI is a bit of a moving target. Right? The definition of AI that the Defense Department adopted back in its 2018 AI strategy was the same one. It's one of many that John McCarthy used in his 1955 submission for funding for that initial conference. And it says that AI refers to the ability of machines to carry out tasks that ordinarily require human intelligence. Well, which tasks ordinarily require human intelligence? The one we haven't figured out how to get machines to do yet, right? When I learned how to drive, I had my friend Rand McNally and a pencil, and that's how I figured out how to get to where I was going, right? And now as my kids learn to drive, they're going to do it all with the GPS on their phones. And so one of the things I think is happening is that in the last 10 years, you talk about the Defense Department's sort of slow adoption of machine vision. Part of the resistance to that, this is just my opinion having watched this, is that they were like, whoa, you want to use AI for targeting? That sounds really scary. I'm not sure that we want to accept that risk, right? But now that we've entered into the generative AI age, if you talk about using deep learning, supervised learning, to create computer vision models to do target recognition, people will think, well, I mean, that's not real AI. Real AI is generative AI, right? And so the adoption is going to catch up, and as Jason says, you're seeing it in Ukraine right now. I remember when that war kicked off, there were a few headlines that said this is the first AI war, and I think those headlines were mistaken. It's the first drone war at this scale, but the drones did not have AI in targeting. But as Jason points out, that's now happening. We're kind of right at the cusp of that occurring in that war. And we're all kind of on the edge of our seats to see how it goes, because if it starts in Ukraine, it's certainly not going to end in Ukraine. And militaries around the world are going to try to adopt those approaches. So those are the two frames for you to think about why we just don't know what the relationship will be between human and machines going forward.
I love that quote. If it starts in Ukraine, it won't end in Ukraine. I think spoken like a true military expert here. So let me turn over to Scott. And we're so glad to have you on the panel because I think the next war could just be a cyber war. I mean, you're right. This is a separate topic, but very integrated. So Scott, as supervisory special agent with the FBI San Francisco division, you bring this critical topic of cybersecurity into our discussion. In your view, is AI benefiting defense services or cyber criminals faster? And what trends are you seeing in how criminals are using it to professionalize their criminaldom?
I think to look at how they're using AI now and how it's affecting cybercrime, we've got to go back a little bit and look at a little bit of history of cybercrime and how it's worked. Anybody here remember the basic definition of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics as it pertains to entropy? I see a bunch of hands, but just to level set real quick, entropy is basically just disorder and chaos, right, in any particular system. And that second law of thermodynamics is that disorder, that chaos, when left alone, without putting energy into that system, that chaos will continue to grow. Disorder will continue to grow. So if you don't clean your room, it gets messy, right? If you don't clean out your email inbox, it becomes a disaster. And so when you put that lens across what does it mean to be sort of a cyber security practitioner, if you're working and you're trying to defend, you're defending against nearly an impossible goal or an impossible force, which is that entropy, that chaos is just growing and growing and growing and growing, and all you're doing is trying to keep it at bay. Because the likelihood that you can get entropy to go from going up to down, that means you've got to be putting in a tremendous amount of resource and time, money, and it's just really, 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 really challenging. And you can look statistically and see that we've been losing that battle, even just from a financially motivated cyber criminal standpoint. We see them making more and more and more and more money every single year. That doesn't mean we're winning. It means we're losing. It means we're expanding our footprint. There's more companies opening up. There's more opportunity for cyber criminals. And the criminals have the easy job. All they're doing is taking advantage of the fact that entropy continues to expand, and they either take advantage of it by exploiting a vulnerability that exists in your network, or they just create a bit more havoc. And so how is that, if you look at the AI tools that exist today that are easily, ubiquitously accessible by any cyber criminal, they're all, just look at the Gen AI tools that exist now, right? All things that enable them to create voice and video and text and photographs and code, all things that just enable them to enhance the existing attacks that they have been using for the last 20 or 30 years. And so it is much easier for them to grab a tool and start doing something with it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but it just continues to create chaos or take advantage of chaos, versus if you're going to take AI and build a tool, that means you've got to put more energy. You've got to work against entropy for a bit. And so right now, criminals have the advantage. There's no question, because they can just grab tools, start using them, and whatever works for them. But I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see a dramatic shift. One of the top 3 vectors that criminals use to get into networks is exploiting known vulnerabilities. And one of the reasons for that is because we as a society and a world have a voracious appetite for something new software, new tools, something new. We want the newest thing. We want it right now. And as a result, we, programmers in general, are introducing more and more and more vulnerabilities into our systems because that's what we're asking for as consumers. And the defenders do not have the capability of patching systems as fast as the vulnerabilities are coming into systems. But if you look forward, and more programmers are going to be using AI tools, they're using them now, and they're going to be using AI tools to create software and to test software for vulnerabilities. AI really has, it's the first time I can think of in the last 17 years that I've seen all these different cybersecurity tools come out. It gives us as defenders the capability of putting in less resource, but actually reducing that amount of entropy, because we're going to have more and more software that comes out that's newer and faster and has those new tools that we want, but with lower amounts or smaller amounts of vulnerability. And I think you're going to see those types of things over time really change the landscape of where cyber criminals are really able to attack. And that landscape, of course, is going to be the soft underbelly of every system, which is us as humans. We're going to be getting attacked more through more social engineering and more phishing campaigns or things of that.
I love it. You heard it here first that in the next 5 years, according to the FBI, we're going to see a dramatic
According to
shift
me
in
personally,
advantage.
whoa. The disclaimer,
According to Scott.
Allison, yeah,
Yes, that's-
according to my personal opinion, I happen to work at the
But
FBI.
it's so nice to have a voice of optimism, so thank you for that. So Marco, your work bridges theory and practice from autonomous spacecraft to AI-driven robotics. From that vantage point, I want to pick up the question I asked Vik. What do you think is technically feasible for robotics and autonomy? How soon do you think we might see robotic soldiers on the battlefield? And what do you see from your work with NVIDIA and elsewhere as the leading edge of autonomy research?
Sure. I mean, as also mentioned by Jason and others, robotics is already part of the battlefield, like with drones. There are other robot embodiments that are quite mature. Quadrupeds, I think, is one of the next logical candidates. Humanoids are also getting quite mature, at least from a locomotion standpoint. But of course, so far, these assets are predominantly supervised by humans. So the next discriminator will be the intelligence that we place on top of these robots. And of course, there are a number of techniques that can be used there. But since you were asking about what is the next key technology people are excited about, I would say one of the most promising ones is represented by so-called reasoning models. So these are new models that have emerged during the past year that are capable of producing human-like reasoning traces. So essentially breaking a problem step by step and then explaining how they arrive at their solution. And this essentially has a number of useful properties. First of all, it allows the model to learn more powerful internal representations that leads to much higher performance. At the same time, a model that can explain why it's doing what it's doing, it allows for introspection, but also better cooperation with either other human assets or other robotic assets. And these reasoning models are already been matured to the level that we can field them in real-world technologies, such as autonomous cars. You were mentioning cars. I think maybe your kid may not need to learn how to drive at all. Maybe autonomous cars are arriving here. So I would say reasoning models is one of those technologies that might really bring the adoption of AI for autonomy for the battlefield to the next level.
But neither of you's quite gotten to what I was hoping for, is sort of a date when we would see robotic soldiers. And do you think that would happen more quickly in the US or China?
China.
So, I mean, it depends how we interpret robotic soldiers. So if we stick with the anthropomorphic embodiment, it will still require some time. But other embodiments, like for example, quadrupeds, are quite mature, not just in terms of capabilities. By now, they're extremely agile. I would recommend you to watch some videos on YouTube. They're really impressive. But they're also relatively cheap. You can get fairly high quality quadrupeds for a few tens of thousands of dollars, which is, by the way, what has made the drones such a powerful weapon in the Russia-Ukraine war. They're powerful, but they're also cheap to produce, and they can be produced in massive amounts. So anthropomorphic embodiments will still require some time. Not even clear, though, if that is really needed, versus, for example, a super agile quadruped with maybe wheels instead of their feet.
Wow. Okay, Davey, I've got more questions, but you want to ask the audience
Yes,
some?
so just before we ask the audience a question, I do have a personal request to Scott. I'm really a nice guy, but could you just tell the FBI and the immigration services to be nice on me whenever I come to the US? I always have a problem. So anyway, having said that, we're going to ask questions to the audience. And I want to give preference maybe to any Russians or Ukrainians or Iranians in the room. If there's anyone, put your hand up. Otherwise, we'll go randomly. There was a lady here. Go ahead.
I just got a curious question for all the Air Force officers and the FBI agents in the House. I just want to understand your perspective on what's more important on the field, instincts or intelligence?
I guess it depends on where on the field you are. I think
In the air? The reason why I ask this question is we're here to talk about AI, and that's all about intelligence and taking it to the next level. But when you are actually on the field, there is a certain type of instinct that the soldiers and the officers have on the field that works better than the intelligence. So I just want your perspective on what out of the two.
I'll take a quick swing at it. I think we are really good at imposing order on complex operations to scope down to narrow the scope of when that instinct matters. But within that scope, it matters a great deal. And so I think intelligence is doing a lot of that scoping, which is why I'm going to say it's the more important thing. But once intelligence scopes you down to where, I'm not a trigger-pulling Army infantryman, but those infantrymen have their finger on the trigger, it's largely instinct that's going to make the difference between pull now or pull a fraction of a second later, and that could be life or death, right? But that's a very narrow application of force that was scoped down by all the intelligence.
Yeah, this idea of like heuristics, I think this is why I think we are not going to see artificial intelligence fielded independently in highly complex scenarios anytime soon. Even in the in the Ukraine-Russia context, they pulled the dimensionality pretty far down, right, so that it can be employed in an autonomous way that generates a predictable effect. But if you have limited training data, super high dimensionality, someone who's trying to purposely confuse you or destroy you, this requires some sense of common sense. And so at this point, I don't think we have autonomous systems that are generalizable in a way that makes them a super competent partner to be in the field.
I think there's also some element of how much time, when you're talking about making decisions, how much time you have to make the decision and how much duress as a human being you are under. Every single person in this room, the more duress you're under and the shorter amount of time you have to make that decision, it becomes harder and harder and harder to get out of the fact that all of our brains are in this 50 to 100,000-year-old mentality of fight or flight when you get to a certain point. And I didn't really answer your question, but there's so many situations where, in retrospect, it would have made sense to do this, this, or this, but you can't take that human element out. Our brains don't get updated overnight. They don't get patched. We're still all susceptible, every single person, susceptible to fight or flight and all of the challenges that come along with how do you make a decision when your brain is under duress.
Okay, we have one last question here. Sorry, one last question.
Thank you. I have a question about the design of the autonomous agents. When we design agents for medical applications, we undergo review to be compliant with many things. When you design agents, for example, for the United States government, for military applications, do you build in safeguards such as the military is not supposed to be used against its own population, or if you have agents that are designed in international settings, do you build in safeguards and ethical standards to follow the rules of international warfare?
Fantastic.
I think I'll let Marco answer this question because it's the same kind of question.
Well, I can answer it from a technical standpoint. In the sense that, of course, there is no silver bullet in how we build safeguards. Of course, in each autonomy stack, you have typically diverse algorithmic pipelines to build in some redundancy in the decision-making process. You have monitoring processes to check, for example, for anomalies, or for example, if the system is leaving its domain of competence, also referred to as operational design domains. And for reasoning models in particular, there are additional safeguards need to be in place. One of them is referred to alignment. So you want to make sure that the reasoning traces that are produced by the model align with the human values. And we do have, this goes back to a point that was made before, we do have different technologies to do that. Of course, by using a supervision from a human, so distilling down values into the machine, or using techniques related to reinforcement learning. So my point here is that there is no silver bullet, but there is a plethora of technology that help with eventually building a safety assurance case for an autonomous system that is meant to operate in safety-critical applications.
In the interest of time, let me just thank you all for coming and say, I think this panel's done an amazing job covering just a few of the ways that AI is rewriting the geometry of power. And all of our panelists have offered to meet outside if people have more questions. But I recommend the next panel, which is on robotics. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much, Alison.
Alison.
Thank you.